As geopolitical and geo-economic crossfires rage across the world, with tariff to terror acts acting as catalysts, one rather significant question has popped up. Are relations between India and China improving? Well, what are the odds of that? Let's analyze. Now, China is engaged in a brutal tariff war with the US. The biggest impact of that will be a strategic reshaping of its export-led economic model with cascading effects across manufacturing, global supply chains, and geopolitical alliances. What's the solution? Well, one of them is an alternate export partner. Meanwhile, despite China's cold political relations with India, especially after the Galwan clash, trade between the two countries is hot. What do I mean? Well, India has been China's second biggest trading partner after the US since 2013. Bilateral trade between the two countries hit $136.2 billion in 2023, which is the second highest ever after 2022's levels of $135.9 billion. Over 35% of India's machinery and electrical equipment imports are from China, including power generation gear and telecom infrastructure. Here's more. China supplies over 70% of India's active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs. Despite the ban on Chinese apps, India imported $6.9 billion worth of mobile phone parts from China in 2023, which are very vital for companies like Apple, Xiaomi, Oppo, etc. There are many such examples. Also, China has been of late making positive noises about improving trade relations with India. For instance, it issued more than 85,000 visas to Indian citizens between January and April this year. Also, following stringent Indian government norms on Chinese companies, firms like BYD and Media have appointed Indian executives to the boards of their Indian units. So, in this episode, we look at what are China's compulsions to improve trading relations with India, and is it actually doing so on ground? It's Thursday, the 1st of May. From the Economic Times, I'm your host Anirban Chaudhury. This is the Morning Brief. My first guest is Wendong Zhang, a professor and economist at Cornell University. In January, Zhang had co-authored a report which had drawn out 6 scenarios of tariff wars between the US and the rest of the world. 2 of those, one wherein US imposed a 10% uniform tariff on all trading partners, and another wherein US and China imposed over 60% of tariffs on each other, seem to be closer to what has actually happened, which is a 10% uniform tariffs on multiple countries and a 145% tariff on China, which retaliated with a 125% tariff on the US. I asked Professor Zhang to explain.
First, I think that US-China deteriorating political relations is far-reaching beyond trade, so it's really hard to resolve. That said, if we're looking at all the really high tariffs, if you put into the economic model will break down, because this will means all the firms will earn negative profits, and there's no sort of embargo between the countries. And the model you referenced, the 60% tariff imposed by the US and retaliatory tariff by China, is in that model, we assume that's sort of a more permanent shock. And so far, I think we're still seeing the playing out. I don't necessarily seeing the 140 or 125%, or today we even saw over 300% tariff on solar panels. And I don't necessarily think that they are permanent, so they are part of the negotiation path. But overall, I think I'm still hoping there might be some reconciliation that will come down to a lower, still substantially higher tariff rates.
Now, in your paper, you predicted GDP contractions in both countries, and there were obviously different, quantum of contractions depending on various scenarios. Would you give me your latest estimates? Because there are frequent and very loud fears of recession.
So suppose we only have a substantial US-China trade war. Both countries will lose economically significantly. And because all other countries in this scenario are not affected, they will actually benefit. And the US will lose close more than 1% of the real GDP permanently if we have a lot of the tariffs stay in place. The loss could be in an order of 2 to 2.5% for the US and substantially even larger than for China as well. And in the 60% retaliatory range, for example, that our model shows that US will lose 0.4%.
0.45.
Yeah, what we envision a global trade war of US imposing tariffs on China, adding 10% beyond the 2019 tariffs, as well as the North American 25% against each other. And as China supply over 70% of the laptops, game consoles, and toys. What is interesting is whether India, Mexico, and Vietnam, for example, can, in a short run, take more market share in producing these products for American and European consumers. As we're speaking now, I think US Vice President J.D. Vance is visiting India. There's a possibility that in some of the trade agreements, there will be some provisions to potentially try to boost the India production of electronics, and also, more importantly, for Vietnam and Mexico, for example, to see whether there's measures to counter trade diversion from China.
Right, right. One takeaway from your answer is that, just for my listeners, is that as things are going now, you predict more than 2% GDP contraction for the US and more than double of that for China if things go in the same vein, which you think they won't, but if they do.
Yes. So if we keep seeing this as persistent, this will be leading to 1 to 1.5% contraction for real GDP for the US at close to 85% tariff. And if we see this goes beyond 125 and 145, this even potentially even more.
You spoke about a trade embargo, and that is clearly what seems to be happening now. If we do enter a de facto trade embargo, how do you think this will fundamentally redefine global supply chains, not only now, but over the next decade?
First, I think I'm hoping that we don't necessarily see that, and the exemption for the electronics shows that the de facto trade embargo is really almost impossible to do. That said, I think in a short run, you will see firms do more trade diversions, as we see in the 2018-2019 trade war, more flows from Chinese products coming from Hong Kong. More Chinese firms will probably open factories in India, in Vietnam, in Mexico. In the long run, there will be incentives to create more regional blocks, potentially strengthening what is known as the friendshoring. So you try to strategically diversify from your partners. And also, from China's perspective, there's already substantial pushes to try to think about what is the scenario where the substantial portion of the demand is not coming from global exports, it's actually coming from domestic consumption by Chinese consumers, especially from rural areas. Right? So
Got it.
there's a lot of push. I think that's probably will be part in more longer term strategy.
So the trade diversion will obviously help other countries. Now, and we've already seen some signs of it in India. We recently had a story on Alphabet, for instance, is diverting a lot of its work from Vietnam to India. Others are also doing that. Are these just low hanging fruits and the impact will ebb and we'll see actually a negative impact because of the trade war? Or do you see actual economic gains for countries like India from this trade war?
I do see that, especially that this current tariff increases, especially the exemption for the electronics, made the U.S. Painfully aware that maybe the reliance on Chinese products is too high. And so I think they will create a strategic incentive for both the governments and businesses to potentially diversify. And India is definitely one of the key destination countries for this diversification. So there's a lot of mixed signals. But in general, I think I agree with your assessment.
As someone who studied China for a very long time, what do you think will be China's move in the next 4 or 5 months?
I think behind the door, China will be working hard to see whether there will be some high-level agreements that both president kind of announced as a win in some APEC meeting or some other high-level setting. But I think that this created enough strategic incentive for them to first keep investing in critical technologies in significant sectors like the semiconductor and related issues within China, and also try to cultivate domestic production base and consumption base, but also other non-US countries as they are trying to do through Belt and Road Initiative, for example.
Now, let's get into the trajectory of the Indo-China trade relations. For this, I spoke to Ashok Kantha, a prominent diplomat and India's former ambassador to China. Listen on.
My association with China as diplomat started in 1981. At that time, we had a very minuscule trade, but in 1984, we signed a bilateral trade agreement under which we gave each other MFN treatment. Whole of 1990s, we were essentially exporting primary commodities, and we were getting some basic manufactured goods and intermediates like chemicals from China. Mm-hmm. I think turning point in our trade relations came turn of the century. Right. As you know, during next one decade, China progressed very rapidly as a trading nation, and it eclipsed USA and Germany as the largest exporting nation by 2013. In parallel, we saw a fairly rapid expansion of bilateral trade, India and China. They had a very small trade surplus in 2001. By 2010, it had already grown to $20 billion. Mm-hmm. So trade was becoming more and more asymmetrical. So that trend, essentially, continued through most of the second decade of the century. Now, what was happening that our basket of export commodities remained rather limited. We were essentially, exporting iron ore, though 2012 restrictions were imposed on that. But, we couldn't get access in Chinese market for products where we were globally competitive. Under our bilateral agreement to 2001, as part of their accession to WTO, they had agreed to give us sign certain agreements on agriculture goods. They also dragged on. And by the time some of them materialized, frankly, our market had changed. Now, when I was there, we suggested to them that, okay, fine, let's look at investment-led trade growth. Xi Jinping came in September 2014, promised large investment, never materialized. Prime Minister went to China in May 2015. He had a meeting with who's who of Chinese business, Jack Ma, and everyone was there. Welcomed them to come and invest in India. We made our best effort to get investment, but frankly, we had serious problems about the nature of investment that came from China. They were in, just to give an example, they invested in cellular handphone. This is one area where value addition seldom exceeded 20%, and they come to control a large chunk of Indian market. And these were data-intensive sectors where we had security concerns, and also we're getting reports about misuse of visas, and we're very liberal in terms of visas at that time. So this led to, even before we had developments in Eastern Ladakh.
Was there always a trade imbalance between the two countries?
If you look at the trajectory of trade, in 2020, our trade deficit for China was $45 billion. Total trade was about $87 billion. In 2024, our trade deficit had gone up to $102 billion. Our total trade had gone up to $138 billion. What I'm saying that we didn't quite constrain trade, though certain trade measures were taken, but by and large, the problem remains unchanged. That of highly asymmetrical trade, that of inability to make dent in Chinese market products where we believe we have competitive advantage, and investment unable to act as a driver of growth of trade. So this is where we stand as of now.
Do you see that changing now?
I will not rush to come to any, positive conclusion at this point of time. In fact, there are concerns that access of China to the US market, whereas, they have a huge trade surplus, is constrained. They will try to sort of dump goods in other markets. China is facing a serious problem. The domestic demand refuses to pick up. In fact, Chinese economy is close to deflation loop. Last 29 months, their producer price index has been in negative territory. The consumer price index is barely positive. So they are unable to stimulate, our domestic demand. So increasingly, they are depending on exports to get their way out of their current economic problems. Last year, the trade surplus was close to $1 trillion. And with India alone, as I mentioned, it was in excess of $100 billion. So I think while they're talking about, boosting their domestic demand, that's something that they have not been able to achieve so far. Number two, when it comes to our exports to China, frankly, we have been struggling ever since 2001. When we supported China's entry into WTO, they made commitments on signing SPS agreements on several agriculture products. Even those products have not been covered so far. In fact, some of them have been given up. It's an uphill task in China, or getting any sort of projects. So I will not really be very optimistic going by comments made by Chinese officials. In fact, there is concern also today that as China becomes a more and more dominant player in high-tech manufacturing, areas like EVs or lithium-ion battery or entire green energy ecosystem, they are really developing excess capacities. And they are exporting goods at prices others can't compete with. So this is another, we don't want a China shock 2.0, where our own industrialization will suffer. And there are similar concerns among other countries, both developed and developing. Putting more substance in economic engagement will require, frankly, a change of heart on part of China.
Well, not everyone shares Ashok Kant's bleak outlook. In fact, my colleague, ET's diplomatic editor Dipanjan Choudhury says that there is enough happening on ground to show an improvement in relations between the two countries.
So the first confidence building measure has been implemented, which is the Kailas Mansarovar Yatra. So that was announced on Saturday by the Ministry of External Affairs. That will be conducted between June and August of this year. That has been one of the key demands from the Indian side to the Chinese side to resume, because that stopped after COVID, and then the Galwan happened, and the relations hit a new low. The Yatra, which is very close to the hearts of several Indians who want to undertake this Yatra once at least in their lifetime, was closed for 5 years, and it has been resumed. It will be resumed. So that's a big step and a CBM which would show that the relations are getting back on track. I wouldn't say that it's a full normal relation, because while the disengagement has happened and India has got patrolling rights, and the two leaders have met last October in Kazan on the sidelines of the BRICS summit. There are certain issues in the Galwan sector which need to be addressed, and the two sides are holding consultations from on a regular basis to address that. We would probably see a resumption of direct flight in near future. It's difficult to put a timeline, but you would see that. That would be a request which the Chinese side has made to India, and a revised agreement is being worked out. So that would be a next step. There are, of course, some Chinese investments which are coming following the Indian norms. They are agreeing to the Indian norms, so that would also contribute to stabilizing ties. And China is the host and the president of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization this year. So they would host a summit in late August, early September. And they have invited Prime Minister Modi to attend because India is a member of the SCO. So if that happens, it would signal the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister to China since 2018.
Okay. What geopolitical factors do you think have led to this? Is there a compulsion on China to find an alternate trading partner now that its geo-economic war with the US is
Mm.
so out in the open?
So that's one of the reasons, definitely, that China is trying to woo India. But it has to be on India's terms and conditions. India has made it clear, and the government has made it clear that India can't be a dumping ground for the Chinese goods. Obviously, the Indian market is very lucrative for China, and there are limitations of other markets for China in Southeast Asia and elsewhere because there is certain saturation in terms of the market size. If you're looking at their partners in Southeast Asia like Cambodia or Laos, I mean, Indonesia definitely has a big population. Philippines-China relations are lukewarm currently, so they are missing out on a big population there. Vietnam, of course, but Vietnam-China relations has its own limitations. So India definitely is very lucrative for China as a trading partner. So between 2002 and 2020, early 2024, there was sort of a status quo. I mean, nothing had moved actually. It's only from 2024, say early 2024, that the Chinese realized that India is an important emerging power and neighbor, and they need to work on what India has been suggesting.
Do you see collaborations in tech also, notwithstanding the major digital security concerns that India has and many other countries also have with China?
No, I don't think that. See, we are not going to be part of a China-led tech world order, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah, India has made it clear. Rather, India would start an independent course with like-minded countries, right? See, France is an example. Like France and India co-chaired the AI summit in February when Prime Minister traveled to Paris. It wants to, I mean, India wants to have its own course on tech. Need not be with the West always, need not be with any other countries to the East, but definitely India is not going to want to be part of a China-led tech world order. On that, there is absolute clarity.
So lots unresolved, but there are green shoots of some positive developments between the two
Yeah,
countries. Thank you
yeah.
so much, Dipanjan, for joining us on the Morning
Mhm.
Brief.
Thank you.
What is amply clear from the goings on in the last few months and the conversations in this episode is that India and China cannot decouple from each other. But whether relations between the two countries will improve depends on a lot of factors. Many of them were discussed today, but there are others too, including India's current fiery conflict with Pakistan, which counts China as an ally. All I can say is that these are interesting times. Lots will happen in the coming months, and we at the Morning Brief will break it down for you in subsequent episodes. That's it for today. This episode was produced by Vinay Joshi, sound designed by Rajas Naik. A new episode of TMB drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, wherever you get your podcasts. Keep listening.